Due Process, honored for 3 consecutive years with the Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Talk Program Series.
Why would someone want to hurt me like that? You know, whether I push him, I'm still weaker than him.
Helping men to find out why, so they won't do it again. That's the goal of this self-help group. New weapons in the war against domestic violence on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
Women murdered by their husbands or boyfriends. Some stats say they account for 1/3 of female violent deaths, and some experts put the number closer to 70%. Those are the homicides. But then there are all those less than lethal attacks, the beatings and abuse that thousands of women suffer every day at home. It raises questions about the nature of the crime and the punishment it deserves, the psychology of the abuser and of the abused. Questions we'll be exploring in the next half hour. But first, here's Sandy King with a program that purports to have some new answers. Sandy?
Raymond, when you look at those stats on domestic violence, it is no wonder there's a search for some new and different answers. Here in New Jersey, nearly 2,000 women each year seek refuge in a domestic violence shelter, while 6 times that number seek non-residential help. And it's all a part of a cycle of violence that is all too hard to break, though one Newark-based program is trying.
I pulled her off the bed. You know, she hit the floor. My kids were there. I mean, this was wild. This was like a nightmare.
You just sometimes just overreact. You just don't want to hear it or listen. I've been hearing it for so long now, I got something to say.
When it happened, I grabbed her, you know, she grabbed me, and it started as a tugging war, and it escalated from that point.
The stories are strikingly similar and sometimes brutally honest.
The tension was just too thick. I mean, I was a walking time bomb.
Then one day you just explode. Ain't nothing you can do about it. You just leave me alone. Just leave me alone.
But the message here is that there's always something you can do.
So we have to look at what is anger.
You can learn to control your rage, or you can just back off.
We have an opportunity to stop it. We have an opportunity to avoid the conflict and avoid the anger.
Avoid the anger and the violence, what this group is all about.
It is a group intervention program for men batterers.
Batterers who are mostly referred by the courts, sometimes as the only alternative to jail.
They came to my house and said they had to, ask me questions and end up locking me up, and the judge asked me if I want to attend the program. I said yes.
But not everyone here has been sent. Some knew they were out of control and found their own way here.
I voluntarily came into this program. I wasn't ordered by the court. I just looked on the internet and found some information, and I came here.
The here is the multidimensional Babyland Family Services, the soul of social services in Center City, Newark.
We had the shelter for women, and after the women leave the shelter, they could come back for counseling. But the piece that was missing is that we did not have funding to deal with the batterer.
But 3 years ago, the funding came through.
And he didn't like the idea of her playing with him, insulting his intelligence. Hey, come on now. I mean, we get that way at times.
The result, the program Men for Peace. And whether you're here by court order or by your own steam, it means making a commitment to what can be a painful process.
I know for me, when I'm not drinking, I'm a nice guy. When I drink, I'm an asshole. And my wife is afraid of me. She doesn't know what I'm gonna do. Maybe she thinks I'm gonna hit my child. Maybe she thinks I'm gonna hit her.
The person must be committed to participating and being present for 24 sessions. So we're talking about 6 months, once a week for 2 hours.
But even after they graduate, some of the men keep coming back.
When I graduated 2.5 years ago, Mr. Saeed said, you're welcome to come back. And then I still get a chance, and I'm still learning. So I may skip a couple weeks, but I think I'm going to always come back.
That may be because these are not just group confessionals. They are teaching sessions, too.
I want you to take your pens and write this down.
The goal, to make women more safe by putting abusive men more in touch with what they do.
Every time I come in, everywhere I go, she's asking me, where have you been?
And why they do it.
I feel I shouldn't have to.
See, but if we don't know what ticks us off, we'll go through that level and wham, we done hit somebody, we done slapped somebody, we done kicked somebody.
It makes you look back at what created that anger in you, Some of us came from different walks of life. Some of us, our parents abused us.
I knew that something had to be done to try to break that vicious cycle of men battering their wives.
He's much stronger than me. Why would he even want to try to hurt me? And in the process of being beaten by someone, they don't stop.
And her husband was one who was sent here to find out.
Throw it out the house.
Throw it out the house, or
He did have to do times on the weekends, and I believe the judge said he had to get some help or whatever, some counseling, and it went from there.
And she believes that court intervention saved her by breaking the pattern of abuse.
That was one plus. He did, step off, if we was having serious problems, like if our argument just got overheated.
Learning to walk away is a big part of the program here.
You have a right to be upset. You have a right to be angry. How you display your anger, how you display being upset is a totally different thing.
And at least one wife sees the lessons learned here back at home.
I believe we are communicating a lot better. I mean, we always communicated, but sometimes it was just kind of cruel to each other. But I believe we kind of like communicating a lot better as far as with a little more peace.
And if this brand of group therapy works, should it be a model for the rest of the state, or is it letting men who commit violence on women off the hook by allowing them to stay out of jail? Well, a bill has been proposed that would set up a special court in one New Jersey county to treat and monitor in lieu of jail. But a report late last year from a state task force called for getting tough on men arrested for domestic violence.
Psychological approach or the punitive? More therapy or more penalty? Some answers from some experts when we come back, so stay with us.
The men that beat the wives, lock them up.
Like fines, give them 30 days in jail. That's the only way they're gonna learn. To me, they getting spoiled, getting away with it, so they're gonna keep doing it.
I think strongly enforce the laws that are currently on the book and create other laws that would be helpful to protect women.
Anger management, all kinds of self-help not to put their hands on a woman.
Lock them up, give them 5 years for putting their hand on their girls.
I think, frankly, people like that ought to be thrown in prison and left there for a long period of time so that they know that it should never happen again.
But it does tend to happen again and again. The recidivism rate for batterers is staggering. So don't we need new strategies for breaking the cycle of violence? Should we make the penalties tougher, or should we look to treatment modalities to make the difference? For some answers, we turn to Assemblywoman Arlene Frischer, who has sponsored new Get Tough legislation, to Ellen Crowley, who runs a counseling program for batterers at the University of Medicine and Dentistry in Newark, and in Newark, to John Cohen, Assistant Director of the Community Change Project of the Volunteer Counseling Service in Rockland County, New York. Welcome to all of you. Assemblywoman, let me start with you by asking you a question that's kind of historical, but I think may put this discussion in context. We really treat violence that happens between two people in the street, for example, between strangers, differently than we treat violence that happens in a domestic setting. What's the historical basis for that? Why do we look at it as a different kind of activity?
I really don't know the answer to that. I believe that perhaps judges and the law in general look at a domestic situation in an entirely different way than they look at two strangers in the street for some strange reason. I really haven't been able to fathom that, but we certainly do look at them differently.
Well, do I take it from your answer that you don't think that the circumstances of domesticity, of living together as a couple, should cause society to treat violence in that context differently from the same conduct if it were to occur in the street or between strangers?
Absolutely not.
Okay. You have a bill that addresses that question in some way. How does the bill that you have in the Assembly address that question?
Well, my bill was an outgrowth of a series of hearings that were held by the Governor's Task Force on Domestic Violence. And during that series of hearings, I decided that perhaps we were going through this unbroken cycle of violence because the courts do nothing or very little to deter the recidivism rate. And that's why I decided to introduce this bill.
Okay. All right, I'm going to come back and ask you something more about the bill in a minute, but I want to ask Ms. Crowley, who works in the counseling context, whether you think there is a reason to look at violence that takes place domestically as different in some way and deserving of different treatment than violence elsewhere.
Well, to my knowledge, the reason the Domestic Violence Act was created was so that the woman did not need to get cooperation from a witness, that she could actually press charges without a witness being there to verify that the violence took place. Intimate partner violence is more dangerous, or it's more of a problem than street violence because it's intimate partner violence. It's someone that you live with on a daily basis.
The idea of counseling, which is obviously part of the report that Sandy prepared for the viewers and is part of your life, is one that is focused on domestic violence in a way that it isn't on other kinds of violence between people. Why do we think of counseling as being specially relevant in this area?
Violence in a domestic context is almost like an addiction. The perpetrator has found one way to resolve a conflict by using power and strength, and uses it once and it's successful, then continues to use it. And counseling, in the context that I perceive it, is to affect a change in behavior and a change in, or a cognitive restructuring of how they believe they can use their power in a more positive way.
Okay. John Cohen in Newark, let me draw you into the conversation by asking you whether the conduct that we categorize as domestic violence, and maybe there are subcategories, maybe it isn't all the same, but is some significant part of that category of conduct diseased or pathological and therefore susceptible of some kind of cure or treatment?
That, in fact, is one of the most common misperceptions, we believe, about the nature of domestic abuse. And what I'd like to present is an alternative perspective on that, which in fact goes back to your first question. Why is domestic abuse and violence treated differently in the legal system from other crimes? That has to do with the fact that sexism, or the differential power between men and women, discrimination against women, has been institutionalized within the legal system for hundreds and thousands of years. And men's violence against women has been sanctioned and supported by every social and cultural and legal institution in our society. So rather than this being a problem of individuals being pathological or broken in some way, we believe that it's a social and a political problem.
All right, let me ask you a question that follows up on that. It sounds to me as though you're saying this is almost an extension in a watered-down version of the old idea that maybe a husband, for example, had a right to beat his wife. If you're saying that, is it true that there's no rational way in which a person should say, these kinds of relationships, the circumstances in which this violence takes place, is one where the victim and the defendant or the accused or the convicted person will be likely back in the same setting again in the future, and therefore we need to take some special steps? Is there no rational perspective outside of sexism that justifies looking at it differently?
The problem with this issue is that it's very complex and very multidimensional. I'm not sure that we can say it's only sexism. It also has to do with the fact that there are so many different forms of institutionalized prejudice and bigotry and oppression in our society, not the least of which is racism and classism, that supports and encourages men to be violent against women, that we need to see it as a very complex problem. But we do believe that sexism is at the heart of this, that men, in fact, have been taught and raised to believe that they have the right to control women's lives.
Now, Assemblywoman, your response to at least part of this larger picture has been to sponsor the bill we talked about earlier, and what does that bill do?
This bill would prohibit a judge from downgrading an assault charge against a batterer, which is a very common situation in the courts today. And I don't want them to be able to downgrade. I want them to automatically upgrade to aggravated assault, so that there are some teeth into this whole problem now, and the batterer knows that there is going to be punishment of some kind.
Now, would that make it different from other assaults? That is, if I walk out in the street and someone assaults me, if the prosecutor decides to do so, and especially if I consent, that assault could be downgraded, as you put it, treated as an assault, but as a less aggravated assault. Is that something that would be impossible under your bill with respect to violence that occurs domestically?
I don't believe so. My concern was that too many of these domestic violence incidents were claimed to be misdemeanors, which they definitely were not, because as we know from statistics, they are the cause of more violence and death and maiming than anything else in our society.
Okay. Ellen Crowley, am I wrong in perceiving that Mr. Cohen's argument that essentially this is not a pathological behavior that can be cured suggests or implies that treatment isn't going to do much good in the context of this category of offenders, and they ought to be maybe treated like other people who commit assaults?
Well, batterers treatment is a very controversial issue today, and when you say a batterer, it almost connotes one type of person, and in actual fact, batterers are many different, they have many different faces. There is no one topology or one way of viewing them as saying this person is psychopathic, this person is narcissistic. They come in all shapes and forms. Batterers can come from any class, any race, any religious or ethnic background. It's a very heterogeneous
So there
group of
isn't a
people.
particular kind of treatment
No.
modality. Well, then why, since it's probably true of people who commit assaults generally, have that same spread of a continuum from disease to just being violent in a way we don't understand, why should we treat or address the needs of this category of people any differently if they are spread across the spectrum like everybody else?
Because of the dynamics of domestic violence, there's the cycle of violence. Also, with a regular assault, if it's a stranger, the criminal justice system will come in, they'll do what they have to do, and it's finished. Where in domestic violence, you have families to deal with. You've got children, wives, husbands, and very often the wife believes in his ability to change and does want to preserve family life. In that matter, sending them just to jail isn't going to change their behavior. You need to provide some type of modality for change.
You've articulated a need to treat them differently because they're going back to the family, but I haven't heard you say that there is a treatment that can be used. In fact, I think I'm hearing you say they have the same spread of problems that a host of other people have.
There are a number of treatments out there today, and there's a lot of research being done on the length of time a batterer needs to be in treatment, the type of treatment that's effective, and we don't have those answers. It's kind of state of the art at this point. New Jersey also does not have a standard, a state standard. A couple of other states do, such as California and Colorado. And I think we're moving in that direction, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot more research generated.
John Cohen, I heard Ellen Crowley articulate at least a need for looking at this category of conduct differently. That is, that these are people who are likely to be living again with the same people who were assaulted on a prior occasion. Does that suggest that there is the need to do something differently with respect to people accused of and then convicted of domestic assault, or should they be treated as all other persons who are convicted of those crimes?
Well, in some ways, both. Historically, domestic violence has not been criminalized at all. Men had the legal right until quite recently to control the women that they were partnered with, especially wives, however they chose, including using severe physical violence. It has been legally sanctioned. So To criminalize it is extremely important, and we support getting tough on men who batter and holding them legally accountable. At the same time, we need to recognize that men are treated differentially by the criminal justice system. Poor men and men of color generally tend to not be treated the same way as white men and wealthy men are treated. So while we need to get tough legally, we need to recognize that there are still problems within the system. Beyond that, we also need to recognize that this is an extremely complex problem that has many social and cultural roots. What the video that we just saw indicated or suggested that many programs are suggesting is that anger is somehow a factor or a cause in men's violence, and we believe that that's not true. Anger does not cause men's violence. The sense of entitlement that men have to control women's lives, the belief that they have the right to mistreat women, is really at the heart of it. So men need to be re-educated, and programs for men who batter that are part of a criminal justice response in which being sent to the program is one penalty or one sanction among an array of sanctions can be helpful, as long as we are not predicating that attendance upon the idea that they are being treated or fixed for some mental health problem.
Do you agree with John Cohen? In particular, do you agree with his statement that within the system, different treatments that have to do with class, status, and race complicate the prospect of finding effective solutions?
That's absolutely true. And I don't know how we're going to break that. It's not going to be within my lifetime, unfortunately. But I do believe that these things do exist within the system right now.
One could easily become demoralized listening to this conversation because, for example, the two of you have been involved with the Governor's and Legislative Task Force. You've been studying this for a long time. And it seems as though the nuances seem to escape us. For example, Ms. Crowley is saying there's a need to continue to look for treatment modalities. You want to get tough in terms of making sure the conduct is criminalized. Mr. Cohen is suggesting that legitimately there needs to be a look at the difference in resources and in treatment based on race and class. What is the sense that you may have that we're making any progress? Because it seems like we revisit this issue almost every year in a frustrated way.
One of the issues that came out of the task force was training for police officers and for the judiciary. Up until the time of the task force, there was training, but it wasn't compulsory for our judges. Now they must attend a certain amount of training every year. And I believe that sensitivity training on their part and on the police officers' part is most important to this whole process.
Now we're running short of time, but there are two questions I want to pose. One to you, Ms. Crowley. Is there a correlation between drug and alcohol abuse and battering that warrants study and maybe difference in treatment?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a very high incidence of substance abuse correlated with domestic violence. The only thing is that it's not cause and effect. It's correlational because there are men who drink who don't batter.
That was an answer I'm struggling with. If it's not cause and effect, what does the correlation mean? That there's overlap, but does it tell us anything about how we should approach it?
If we look at it as a cause and effect, then we're going to send a batterer to an alcohol and drug program and assume that he's going to be cured. And even if he is cured of his alcoholism or his drug addiction, that does not mean that he's cured of his violence.
Assemblywoman, what's happening with your bill? You introduced it a year ago. I would have thought that within a year there would have been movement on the bill. Why hasn't it been passed?
It's further back than that. This is the second time I've introduced it.
Okay.
It's sitting in the Law and Public Safety Committee right now, and I really don't have a clue as to why it is still sitting there and hasn't been.
Is there significant principled opposition, or is this just part of a piece of legislation stuck in the mud for no apparent reason?
I believe it's stuck in the mud for no apparent reason. I haven't heard opposition to it.
Does that suggest that this issue has a priority for you and for Ms. Crowley and for Mr. Cohen and others who focused on it, but that society at large still, despite maybe 10 years of discussion, has not made this issue a high priority?
I would say so. Until it affects people in society, they really are not focused on this issue. And I believe that that's a good part of the problem.
If, Mr. Cohen, if you could make one change in our thinking about this issue, can you explain it in 20 seconds?
What I would like to say is that we need to recognize that men who batter are not monsters, they're not crazy, they're not out of control, they're not some subset of the population. They are normal, everyday men. They are our brothers, our fathers, our sons, our best friends. all of whom have been taught to believe that we have the right to treat women as second-class citizens. And that mentality and that attitude is what needs to change.
I want to thank you, and I suspect we'll be back looking at this issue again. But for now, that's it for this edition of Due Process. But you'll want to join us next time when we take on another issue of law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
About, let's say, recognizing that any man should be held accountable for his abusive and certainly violent, physical, violent behavior towards women. And let me add this, that the mission of the program is to help the men to establish a sense of equality, love, understanding, and mutual respect for all females.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,